This week's cold case is on the Klein Brothers missing from Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Klein Brothers disappeared November 10th, 1951. As always, before we get into this case, let's see what was happening in the U.S. in 1951. Harry S. Truman was our 33rd president. I Love Lucy premiered for the first time on CBS.
I'm just glad that I have the cutest, sweetest, most wonderful husband in the whole wide world.
Dennis the Menace comic strip appears in newspapers across the U.S. for the first time. One of the worst rail disasters in American history happened, the Woodbridge train wreck. But in Minneapolis, Minnesota, 3 brothers went out to play in Fairview Park and never returned. Kenneth, David, and Danny Klein were the 3 younger sons of Kenneth and Betty Klein. Kenneth Jr. was 8 years old, David was 6, and Danny was 4 years old. November 10th, 1951, was a typical cold day in Minneapolis. The 3 boys begged their mother to go to Fairview Park, which was just 3 blocks from their home on Colfax Avenue. At first, their mother Betty said no, as it was in the 40s that day and cold, but she eventually gave in and let them go. The boys, excited, put their coats on and left the home around 1:30 p.m. Their older brother, Gordon, was at 9 at the time, told them he'd meet up with them later. However, when Gordon arrived at the park a few hours later, his brothers were nowhere to be found. Gordon quickly ran home to tell his parents, Kenneth and Betty, and they called the police. The police originally wanted to wait 24 hours to see if maybe they'd return, but the parents wanted to start searching right away. When the police finally got involved, they searched with dogs and the Boy Scouts came and helped. Most of the search focused on the Mississippi River and St. Anthony Falls and Dam. They lowered the water level and dragged the river. Civil Air Patrol pilots skimmed the surface of the river and said the water was so clear they could see discarded tires and toilet seats lodged in the riverbed, but there was no sign of the boys. The boys' mother, Betty, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, made an emotional plea to please search everywhere. On November 13th, a few days after the boys went missing, a discovery was made that changed the course of the search for the missing brothers. A railroad worker spotted 2 woolen caps close together on the ice on the west bank of the Mississippi River. Kenneth and Betty did seem to identify the hats, but they didn't believe the hats could have floated for 3 days on the river. They believed the hats were put there intentionally. The police then made a decision that certainly wouldn't have happened today. After the discovery of the hats, police said they believed the boys accidentally drowned. The case was closed just 5 days after the brothers went missing. Their older brother Gordon is adamant that his brothers wouldn't have ventured to the river without him. They knew he would be joining them soon. Also, there is no reports of the boys being sighted at or near the river that day. Sadly, Kenneth and Betty Klein had to take over the police's job in finding their missing children. And after the police closed the case so quickly, they put up a $500 reward and would follow up on any leads or tips they heard about. They had a lot of support from the community, but also had to deal with hang-up calls and cruel letters. There was even a ransom note, and when the FBI helped with setting up a meeting with the letter writer, the writer didn't show up. Decades passed, but they never gave up looking. In the 1990s, the family contacted Unsolved Mysteries after collecting 10,000 signatures on a petition. But before filming was to start, the show pulled out. The same thing happened with Maury Povich, with no explanation as to why. Throughout the years, the family would on a regular basis hang flyers of the boys and even placing ads in the newspapers saying, "We want our boys home and you can even call collect and stay anonymous." The Kleins moved to Monticello, Minnesota 3 years after their sons disappeared, and they went on to have 4 more boys. Of course, their missing sons were on their mind every single day. They would bake the lost boys birthday cakes and buy them gifts at Christmas in case they returned. And they also visited schools across the state in case the boys had been adopted and were being raised by another family. There are a couple of theories and a few people that some found of interest. However, since police closed the case after 5 days, these people were never named suspects officially, but worth noting. Richard C. Fossey. He was a playground worker at Fairview Park, whom the boys were said to have been familiar with. He is reported to have moved out of the area soon after the boys' disappearance. In 1955, it is believed that Richard Fossey came under investigation for the murder of 3 Chicago boys. However, many years later, someone else was arrested for that crime. Fossey died in 1962. Lloyd Paddock, a truck driver who lived near the Kleins, acted oddly around the time the boys went missing. According to a neighbor, Lloyd poured a new concrete floor in his basement around the same time. He had arranged for people to come help him do it the next day, but when they arrived, he said he had already finished it. But that would have required him to stay up all night and would have been a huge task to do alone. Lloyd also replaced the wood in the bed of his pickup truck around that time, and when a neighbor asked Lloyd if he was going to join in on the search for the boys, he replied, "They're not worth looking for." An important thing to note also was that if the boys wanted to cut through yards instead of using the sidewalk for a shortcut to the park, they almost certainly would have cut through Lloyd's yard that day. He passed away in 1975. An unknown woman dying of cancer spoke to a PI that was hired by the family in an interview in 2017. She said she rented a room in the area to a creepy man that was in his 50s and a teenager. She claimed she spotted her renters playing basketball with some boys she didn't know around the time the Kleins went missing. They matched the boys' descriptions. She said she kept quiet at the time out of fear of her renter. The younger Klein brothers believe the black market adoptions theory. Although there is no proof that this is what happened to the Klein brothers, they were happening at the time. It may have been easy on the idea of going on a fun adventure to convince 3 young boys to go somewhere with someone they didn't know. The younger brothers always pictured their lost brothers being raised by a nice family. I'm sure part of the reason was that was much easier to envision than the other possible outcomes. As far as the police theory of accidental drowning, a medical professional weighed in with his thoughts. He said the drowning theory was an injustice, a bad conclusion. He stated the odds were close to 1 in a million that 3 boys could go in the river and none of them ever resurface. Their older brother Gordon was always tormented about not going with his brothers that day from the beginning. He feels he could have protected them from what happened that caused them to disappear. He said in many ways his childhood ended that day. He struggled with being a member of the new Klein family and his new siblings. He has lapses of memory, couldn't even remember that fateful day for years, and even spending time with the family was painful in some aspects, all due to the trauma of the boys disappearing. He lost his best friends that day, and he struggled with making connections with his new brothers that were born years later. Kenneth Klein died in 2005, and Betty Klein died in 2013, never knowing what happened to their 3 sons. If anyone has any information on the Klein brothers, please call the Minneapolis Police Department at 612-673-2853. If you like this video, give it a like. Also, follow and or subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. Make sure to check out our shorts and reels as we post daily. And if you have a cold case that you want covered, be sure to let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye, guys.